The pre-dawn chill of the Highveld had not yet burned off when the emergency call filtered into the police dispatch, an unbelievable tremor originating from the tightly controlled, affluent Silver Woods country estate. It was Valentine's Day, but the air around the high perimeter walls felt only like February ash, heavy with unspeakable tragedy. Detective Senior Superintendent Radebe navigated the winding, manicured lanes, passing the silent, colossal homes built for secrecy and solitude. He was met not by routine patrol, but by the flashing, aggressive lights of the CSI vans and the immediate, oppressive presence of media satellites already hovering like vultures just beyond the main security cordon. This was not a typical murder scene. This was a national spectacle waiting to happen, a collapse of heroic mythology. Radebe stepped onto the property, the polished cobblestones crunching under his heavy boot. The house itself was vast, a study in cold, minimalist architecture. Inside, the noise was restrained, professional, the hushed, efficient language of specialists moving through a crime scene. Dr. Naidu, leading the forensic team, already wore the grim, focused mask of someone processing the unthinkable. The athlete stood in the kitchen, a figure of profound and disturbing contradiction. He was the nation's celebrated hero, the symbol of defiant resilience, yet now he was a slumped ruin, draped in sweatpants and the unmistakable stain of wet crimson. His prosthetic limbs, the sculpted carbon fiber that had carried him to Olympic glory, lay carelessly tossed aside near the entryway, symbols of both his power and his vulnerability rendered inert. He wept raggedly, offering the initial, simple explanation of a tragic, fear-driven error against an imagined intruder. Radebe approached the bedroom wing, his gaze sweeping across the scene. The room itself was immaculate save for the violence centered on the bathroom suite. 4 spent casings lay scattered across the pristine white floor tiles. The heavy, bolted wooden door, now violently splintered and wrenched from its hinges, displayed the brutal geometry of the bullet's passage. Through the hole, a clear line of sight traced the trajectories. The small, enclosed space within the bathroom stall had amplified the sound, trapped the terror, and focused the lethal force. The victim lay where she had fallen, struck multiple times. Her stillness was profound, her presence already dwarfed by the monstrous horror inflicted upon her. Radebe's professional detachment threatened to buckle under the weight of the celebrity presence and the immediate, obvious gulf between the public persona and the private violence. The official narrative was already solidifying in the media. A terrible mistake, a heroic figure protecting his home. But Radebe was trained to observe the details that screamed louder than any prepared statement. He noted the way the blankets were neatly thrown back on one side of the large bed, suggesting only one person had risen suddenly. He registered the complete lack of forced entry anywhere else in the massive structure. Most critically, he focused on the path of the bullet. They tracked unnaturally low, impacting the door at a height suggesting the shooter was either kneeling, sitting, or, more disturbingly, standing directly on the residual limbs, without the benefit of the height-augmenting prosthetics. This detail, instantly catalogued, became the critical fissure in the foundation of the defense. If the athlete genuinely believed he was facing a dangerous intruder and had the time to retrieve a weapon, why had he not taken the time to attach the blades? His true form of defense and mobility? The question hung in the cold air, indicting the narrative of pure fear. The methodical hunt for truth had begun, demanding the dismantling of a carefully constructed mythology through procedural rigor. The crime scene investigation team worked through the next hour, establishing a clear perimeter, photographing every angle, and tagging the physical evidence. The weapon, the casings, the fragmented door, and the blood spatter patterns within the confined toilet area. Dr. Naidu focused on the trajectories, mapping the line of fire back to the standing position of the shooter. The initial report confirmed 4 shots fired through the door. The immediate priority shifted to the victim's body, requiring transport to the laboratory for autopsy to establish the precise time of death and the nature of the wounds. The sheer volume of international pressure was already palpable, threatening to contaminate the scene and corrupt the process before the first forensic report was even drafted. Radebe felt the weight of the nation's scrutiny settling upon his shoulders, demanding not a quick closure, but a clean, unassailable truth. The athlete was escorted away, his celebrity status affording him a brief, protected transit to the police station for official questioning, a formality Radebe knew would yield nothing truthful until the physical evidence spoke for itself. Radebe ordered a comprehensive digital sweep. Surveillance footage from the estate, cell phone records, and any communication history between the victim and the accused. The reality was grim. The investigation was not a pursuit, but a slow, painful excavation beneath layers of fame and privilege. The procedural demands escalated exponentially. A comprehensive sweep of the surrounding properties was mandated, seeking neighbors who might have been awakened by the noise. The sheer volume of the gunshots, magnified by the night's stillness and the echoing tilework, should have been impossible to ignore. Radebe knew the immediate defense would pivot on mistake and confusion, but the forensic evidence was already leaning heavily towards chronology, proving that the sequence of events was deliberate, not accidental. The quiet efficiency of the investigative team was the only thing standing between the truth and the powerful machinery of celebrity defense. The pathologist's preliminary call arrived just as the sun crested the horizon, casting long, stark shadows across the now empty entrance hall. The time of death was consistent with the initial call, placing the shooting shortly after 3 in the morning. More critically, the victim's stomach contents suggested she had eaten only a few hours prior, contradicting any possibility she had been sleeping soundly for a long duration, lending credence to the idea she had been awake and perhaps involved in some late-night activity or, more likely, a heated exchange. The case hinged not on who pulled the trigger, but on the crucial moments leading up to and including the 4 fatal discharges, demanding meticulous reconstruction of the silent, violent moments locked away inside the house's cold confines. The first major challenge materialized immediately. Detective Bota, the initial lead investigator, returned from the police station, his face etched with strain. He reported inconsistencies in the evidence collected earlier. Certain items, ammunition from an earlier search, and even one of the spent casings from the scene, had been catalogued improperly or, inexplicably, had gone missing entirely. A catastrophic failure of protocol had already occurred in the high-stakes environment. Radebe realized the investigation was compromised before it properly began, forcing him to take over the immediate oversight and quarantine the compromised initial team. The national hero was protected not only by his fame, but by the apparent incompetence or deliberate sabotage already infecting the heart of the procedural process. Radebe secured the chain of custody, ordering the immediate reprocessing of the entire crime scene by Dr. Naidoo's specialized unit, treating nothing from the initial evidence collection as reliable. The media coverage exploded, painting the athlete as a heartbroken victim of a tragic mistake. Public sentiment, fiercely protective of their idol, demanded immediate acceptance of the intruder theory. But the quiet certainty of the ballistics expert, Dr. Naidoo, whispered a different truth. The trajectories were too precise, the angle too specific. 4 shots, grouped tightly through a thin wooden door. It required focus, not panic. It required intent. The core investigative team retreated to the precinct's war room, ignoring the furious external noise. The focus narrowed to the sound environment of the estate. They needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed audio confirmation. The team began reviewing every scrap of neighbor testimony, searching for the subtle clues hidden within the noise of the quiet, wealthy community. A scream, a raised voice, a sound that definitively occurred before the rapid sequence of the gunfire. The sheer procedural necessity of locating this sound, the proof of agitation preceding the violence, became the primary objective, demanding hours of painstaking audio forensic analysis in a desperate race against the looming defense strategy already preparing to drown the truth in doubt and celebrity protection. Dr. Naidu presented the preliminary findings on the door itself. Microscopic wood fibers showed the entrance wounds were consistent with the athlete standing low, likely on his stumps, as Radebe had initially hypothesized. This detail annihilated the notion that he had been in a state of confused panic, scrambling to protect himself. Retrieving his prosthetics would have been the first instinct if full mobility and stability were needed against a perceived threat. The deliberate decision to fire from an unstable, low posture suggested a more cold, calculated rage, or at the very least, a spontaneous, unthinking impulse born of volatile proximity, contradicting the idea of a defensive stand. The narrative of the accidental shooting was crumbling under the weight of precise physics. The pressure mounted from the highest echelons of the police service, demanding transparency and rapid resolution. The political sensitivity of prosecuting a national icon was immense. Radebe fielded calls laced with veiled warnings about the reputation of the service and the economic fallout of discrediting the athlete. The media published continuous leaks, suggesting the investigation was flawed, focusing heavily on the initial investigators' admitted procedural blunders. The internal environment was as hostile as the external one. Radebe doubled down, assigning 2 specialist analysts to reconstruct the victim's final hours through digital forensics, focusing specifically on communication immediately preceding the violence. He believed the motive was not random fear, but something intimate, volatile, and discoverable in the history of their relationship. The digital analysts found the initial piece of compelling evidence: a series of heated, late-night text exchanges between the athlete and the victim, not minutes before the shooting, but spanning the previous day. The tone was sharp, possessive, and accusatory on the athlete's part. One message, sent only 4 hours before the shooting, implied a fear of abandonment and a controlling desire to know the victim's precise movements. This was no longer a mistaken intruder. This was a relationship imploding under the strain of celebrity, ego, and volatility. Radebe immediately linked this discovery back to the victim's stomach contents and the likely time of argument. The sequence was beginning to define itself: confrontation, argument, retreat, and lethal, focused action. The investigation shifted completely, moving away from searching for external evidence of an intruder and focusing entirely on the internal dynamics of the relationship. They sought witnesses not to the break-in, but to the couple's recent volatile history. They tracked down previous domestic disputes, often managed by the athlete's own powerful support team to keep the incidents quiet. They discovered a pattern of possessiveness and aggression masked by the public image of the devoted, tragic hero. The psychological profile of the perpetrator hardened. Not a man paralyzed by fear, but a man accustomed to control, driven to irrational violence when that control was threatened. The team achieved a critical breakthrough when audio specialists isolated sound data from a distant neighbor's voice recording, captured unintentionally by a home security system during the early morning hours. The recording was faint, distorted by distance, but after painstaking purification, the crucial sounds were undeniable. There was a sequence of high-pitched screams, identified through spectral analysis as a female voice, followed by a pause and then the rapid succession of the 4 shots. The sequence was devastatingly clear. The screams happened before the discharges, completely destroying the claim that the athlete was silently startled by an intruder and fired in sudden panic. If he had mistaken her for an intruder, why the screaming prior to the shooting? The implication was that she was screaming at him, in terror, during a confrontation. Radebe authorized the preparation for a highly sensitive, physically intensive reconstruction of the crime at the estate. This would be the final, irrefutable test. They would use specialized police officers, standing at the athlete's specific height limitations, both with and without prosthetics, to fire non-lethal marking rounds into a duplicate door under controlled lighting conditions, proving the exact trajectories and angles. Simultaneously, sound engineers prepared to record the noise level and echo characteristics of the shots and the screams within the confined space, overlaying the verified neighbor recording. This reconstruction was the pinnacle of procedural evidence, designed to obliterate any lingering doubt based on emotion or celebrity status. The reconstruction took place under heavy security, away from the immediate glare of the press, though the tension was unbearable. Using the duplicate door and the forensic measurements, the team proved definitively that the athlete, firing from his stumps, was positioned precisely to strike the victim through the door. The sound tests were equally conclusive. The screams were clearly audible moments before the shots, echoing precisely the neighbor's recording. When confronted with this unassailable procedural truth, the physical evidence, the digital history, and the audio chronology, the athlete's meticulously constructed facade finally shattered. The final revelation was painful in its simplicity. It was not the product of fear, but the consequence of a jealous rage spiraling into lethal action, confined within the luxury bathroom. The investigation reached its end, delivered by the cold, irrefutable language of forensic science. Radebe stood later in the quiet evidence room, the artifacts of the case, the splintered door, the spent casings, the athlete's carbon fiber blades, now sealed and tagged, transformed from symbols of tragedy into instruments of justice. The public narrative had been dismantled piece by piece, replaced by the grim clarity of procedural fact. The cost was immense, both professionally and personally, but the truth, hard-won and meticulously documented, had prevailed over the blinding distraction of celebrity worship. The victim, momentarily forgotten under the shadow of her famous killer, was finally afforded the dignity of having her truth revealed. Radebe looked toward the city, knowing the trials and appeals would continue, but the core of the matter was sealed. The investigation, guided by relentless integrity, had found its measure of justice. The quiet professional duty, executed in the face of overwhelming chaos, remained the sole, incorruptible constant. The aftermath of the reconstruction demanded immediate attention to the psychological dimensions of the case, shifting focus from ballistic evidence to criminal intent. Delving into the athlete's mind required an entirely different set of tools, moving beyond the mere sequence of events to understand the deep-seated mechanisms of rage and self-deception. The prosecution's theory, now solidified, hinged on proving premeditation or, at the very least, dolus eventualis, legal terminology confirming that the shooter foresaw the lethal consequences of their actions and proceeded regardless. Specialist criminal profilers joined the investigation, mapping the unique pressures exerted by extreme celebrity status on an already fragile personality. They analyzed the chasm between the athlete's public image of controlled heroism and the private existence characterized by paranoia, insecurity, and an obsession with firearms. This dual identity, the flawless champion and the volatile, controlling partner, became the new battleground. Consequently, the team expanded their inquiries, interviewing former friends and associates who had witnessed moments when the mask slipped. These accounts painted a consistent picture of explosive tempers and a constant need for external validation, all shielded by layers of wealth and public relations management. Further analysis of the athlete's electronic devices revealed a pattern of obsessive online behavior. Search histories and archived communications showed a preoccupation with home defense scenarios that bordered on the irrational, coupled with a deep-seated fear of vulnerability inherent in his physical condition. This evidence refuted the sudden, spontaneous panic defense. Instead, it indicated a mind primed for confrontation, viewing the world as an inherently hostile environment. Consider, then, how this ingrained paranoia transmutes when coupled with the intense stress of a failing, volatile romantic relationship. The slightest disagreement could, in this environment, be interpreted not as domestic friction, but as an existential threat requiring immediate, ultimate response. Another crucial layer involved examining the victim's own attempts to navigate the increasingly toxic dynamic. Witnesses close to her detailed instances where she had planned to leave, often expressing fear not just of his anger, but of the isolation imposed by his celebrity bubble. They described a calculated campaign of emotional manipulation designed to keep her dependent and silent. This established a critical timeline leading to the confrontation, the victim's attempt to assert independence colliding violently with the athlete's overwhelming need for dominance. The toilet stall, therefore, served not as a hiding place from an external threat, but as the final, desperate refuge from a threat already inside the relationship. The prosecution's approach pivoted sharply, demanding the presentation of the athlete's character flaws. His impulsivity, his short fuse, his gun obsession, as direct, causative elements of the crime, not simply unfortunate background details. This required the legal team to meticulously structure their presentation, ensuring the jury could perceive the psychological progression from possessiveness to violence. It was necessary to strip away the veneer of the hero and reveal the dangerous, unstable man beneath, demonstrating that the emotional context of the shooting was the true motive. Building on this framework, investigators pursued financial records and endorsement contracts. They found that the athlete's immense fame carried equally immense financial obligations, creating an environment where the maintenance of his public image was paramount. Any personal scandal or public breakup posed a significant threat to his entire career structure. This provided a chilling, pragmatic motive, preventing a messy, public separation that could jeopardize millions. The narrative was no longer just about love and loss. It became a grim intersection of fragile ego, extreme wealth, and the lethal defense of a carefully constructed brand. The case became a study in the corrosive effect of unchecked fame on human morality, where personal failings were deemed less costly than professional failure. The immense pressure that had characterized the preceding weeks did not simply dissipate after the forensic reconstruction. Instead, it transmuted into a profound, heavy silence, the kind that follows the shattering of a brittle monument. Detective Radebe sat in the sparse light of his office, the cityscape outside muted by the persistent drizzle, reflecting on the long journey from the initial chaos of the crime scene to this point of undeniable certainty. The investigation had functioned less as a linear pursuit and more as a deep, agonizing excavation, requiring the systematic removal of layers of public myth and strategic denial. Inevitably, this deep dive revealed how closely intertwined the extraordinary nature of the accused's celebrity status was with the pathology of the crime itself. The scrutiny had stripped away the protective coating afforded by adoration and sponsorship, exposing a core vulnerability that festered into control and ultimately, catastrophic violence. The entire procedural framework, every tedious hour spent tracking digital footprints and calibrating acoustic shadows, had been necessary not just to find the truth, but to arm that truth against the overwhelming machinery designed to obscure it. This was the critical battle, not against the defendant himself, but against the narrative of exceptionalism that sought to excuse the inexcusable. The true exhaustion settled in knowing that the scientific integrity of the work, the measured, methodical triumph of physics and ballistics, now stood alone against the immense emotional tide of public disbelief. The psychological profiles and the careful chronology of communication logs converged like streams meeting a river, proving that the tragedy was homegrown, incubated within the walls of an affluent bubble where fame had provided a false sense of impunity. This was the final, terrifying implication, that heroism, when coupled with unchecked fragility, is merely a short distance from destruction. Reflecting on this journey so far, one sees clearly how the dedication to procedure acted as the ethical compass in a storm of moral ambiguity. When the initial steps faltered, threatening to derail the pursuit of justice, it was the stubborn refusal of the specialized units to accept anything less than absolute certainty that retrieved the case from the abyss. This procedural victory ensured that the facts, cold and impartial, could speak louder than the powerful, grieving voice of a fallen idol. It was a lesson in the necessity of bureaucratic rigor, that justice is not served by emotion or speed, but by the relentless, quiet documentation of reality. The culmination of these efforts established a structural integrity that no defense could easily undermine. Every piece of contradictory evidence, every subtle shift in the athlete's internal narrative, had been mapped against the fixed points of scientific measurement. The gaps between what he claimed to be true and what the evidence incontrovertibly proved were vast, creating a chasm of credibility. The path ahead, while legally demanding, was now morally clear. The focus shifted entirely to the accountability owed not to the nation's former hero, but to the forgotten victim whose presence had been violently erased by a moment of possessive rage. The time for investigation was closing, the time for judgment was at hand. The relentless, driving rain of the preceding weeks finally gave way to a cold, pale sunlight that did little to warm the stone facade of the precinct headquarters. Detective Radebe stood by the window, observing the street below. The traffic now flowed normally, the daily rhythm of the city having absorbed the shockwave of the tragedy. Yet, the air within the specialized units remained thick with the residual charge of the impossible task completed. The meticulous process of reconstruction was over, the evidence sealed in tamper-proof containers, transitioning from investigative fact into the rigid language of judicial exhibits. The case was now officially ready for the courts, delivered by the quiet, unyielding power of procedural integrity. What the investigation had ultimately revealed was not merely the sequence of 4 gunshots, but the devastating fragility of constructed mythology. The athlete's life had been a masterpiece of control, a narrative of triumph over profound physical limitation. This very control, however, became the toxic ingredient in his personal life, warping into a possessive rage when challenged. The investigative team, comprised of analysts, ballistics experts, and crime scene technicians, had performed a necessary national service, dismantling a universally admired facade piece by painstaking piece, ensuring that the sheer weight of a public persona could not crush the simple, tragic reality of the crime. The truth was found in the low-impact marks on the door, in the faint, distant recording of a scream preceding the gunfire, and in the digital traces of a relationship dissolving under extreme internal heat. The case provided a harrowing lesson that celebrity, wealth, and heroic achievement function as powerful anesthetics against accountability. For a fleeting moment in the public imagination, the hero was granted a compassionate benefit of the doubt that the evidence proved entirely unwarranted. The real heroism, Radebe understood, belonged to the scientists and the police personnel who resisted the immense pressure to expedite, who refused to accept the comfortable lie, and who insisted that the principles of forensic science be applied equally, regardless of the person standing accused. This dedication served as the essential bulwark against societal sentiment, guaranteeing that the rule of law remained tethered to impartial reality. The final insight resonated with the deep cynicism inherent in police work. Every great public story conceals an equally great, often destructive, private instability. The carbon fiber blades, once symbols of soaring achievement, were in that moment of violence merely incidental prosthetics, proving the shooter was grounded, enraged, and focused on his target. The investigation granted the victim, whose voice had been silenced by lethal force and whose memory was almost submerged by the media circus surrounding her killer, the final, undeniable validation of the truth. As the city below began to absorb the evening light, Radebe turned from the window. The struggle for justice was a continuous, often ugly, endeavor, but it was sustained by the unshakable commitment to procedure. The ultimate purpose of the badge was to serve those who could no longer speak, to ensure that the facts, no matter how politically inconvenient or socially painful, were elevated above the din of spectacle. The successful closure of this investigation was a quiet promise that no life, no matter how humble, would be diminished by the stature of its aggressor. The work was finished, but the vigilant defense of procedural truth against the chaos of human frailty would always continue.